Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you hear me fine. Okay, great. My name is Katrin Gersdorf, as you can see on my tile. I am the chair of American Studies here at Wutzburg University. For those of you who are zooming in from outside Würzburg or even outside the country or even outside the continent, I'm here actually in my capacity as the head of the Environmental Humanities, a class at the Graduate School for the Humanities here at Wutzburg University. Today, one of the co-hosts of this event, together with my colleagues Ina Bergmann and Maria Eisenmann, who represent IrishStudies Würzburg. And before we begin today's lecture, before we welcome Maureen O'Connor, today's speaker, we would like to briefly introduce that framework, Irish Studies Würzburg and the environmental humanities here. As some of you may have already seen, this event is being recorded. The recording is already underway, so if you do not want to appear on the screen with your face, turn off your cameras now, even though we will deeply regret not to be able to see you. But we can also understand if you feel more comfortable with the cameras off. So, environmental humanities, I assume that to many of you, it's a familiar term. It's basically an initiative, a framework for conducting literary, cultural, social studies, history with a particular form of humans and human society in the non-human environment. And as such, the environmental humanities actually are interested in at least modifying, if not completely changing, a paradigm of studying things human, to put it that way, with much more of an emphasis on the non-human, on nature, so to speak, and with an interest on taking the human basically off of his, her, its pedestal, so to speak, that it had, that it occupied for so many years, and to centuries, and to emphasize the fact that we live in relation with other living beings, but also with the non-living world. And today's talk will certainly address that. With a particular emphasis on, let me say, two environments, perhaps. One is Ireland, the geopolitical, geocultural, geo-ecological region, and the other environment is going to be literature. And about that specific environment and how it pertains to what we do here at Wutzburg University, Maria Eisenmann will say a few words, and then Ina Bergmann will properly introduce Maureen O'Connor, our speaker today. Maria, the mic is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So hello, everybody. So also say welcome to all of you. And I want to say some words on IrishStudies Würzburg. So many of you might know that Ina Bergmann and I founded IrishStudies Würzburg. I think it's 2 years ago now, yeah. And I just show you our screen. I share my screen and show you a bit around our website just for a couple of minutes. So you hopefully you can see it now here. You can read that on your own. So about us, why we actually came to found or why we actually started with IrishStudies, and how did it come actually to the foundation of IrishStudies 2 years ago. And it is, as you can read it here, that the Irish monks, Cillian, Colonnad and Totnan actually brought the religion into our continent or into our city. But I think it's not only because of that, not only because we are supposed, as you can read it here, to be the Irish city on the continent, but also out of real interest that Ina Bergman and I came up with this idea. And over many private and also professional visits to Ireland, both of us have strong personal interest in the Irish culture, language and literature. We both regularly offer seminars on the topic, and we actually also organized an excursion together with students to Ireland in 2017. Unfortunately, we cannot have any excursions at the moment, as we all know. Just a very brief look here. If you're interested in our website or in our upcoming events, what we're doing, you can all see that here. So we are in the middle of this one here, our workshop today, and here are upcoming events. Okay, so talks, guest lectures next year in January, and we already sorted something for the summer term. We have lots of members actually at the moment. If you have a look here, if you take this tile, so you can see quite a good list, I would say, at the moment. We're still working on it, but we have some members, and we also have cooperations, because, well, it doesn't work. It is actually an interfaculty association which combines the teaching and research in Irish studies. And our major goal, I would say, in this research is to bring together various departments of our university in the first place, which deal with literature, language and Irish history. But next to our academic university members, we have those cooperations that you can see here. Ephesus, for instance, which is well, closely connected to us, of course, but also other academic and non-academic fields. For instance, Celt, coming from Cork University, they also had or gave a lecture on their project last year. Also our writing center, members of the German-Irish Society here in Wutzburg, and teachers of schools around here, and also the Irish Embassy, as you can see here in the list. So I don't go through all of that now, the activities and research and teaching. If you're interested, you can do that on your own. We also have videos and podcasts that you can listen to or watch from recent events, and everything that is upcoming, as I just told you, you can see here on the very right. So this is very briefly and very basically that what we're doing. So I stop sharing my screen, and before you start, Maureen, I actually want to thank Ina for organizing this workshop, and I particularly say thank you to Lena, Antonius, Bianca and Anne for your great support in organizing this event today, this workshop. And we are very happy to have you here, Maureen, for today, for your input, for your incentive talk. And to introduce you, I pass on the word to Ina.
Thank you very much, Katrin and Maria. So very well welcome to everyone also from me. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished guest lecturer. We are excited that Dr. Maureen O'Connor, who's an expert in environmental humanities and Irish studies and an authority on Irish writer Edna O'Brien, is here with us today. She's the author of The Female and the Species, the Animal in Irish Women's Writing, which was published in 2010. She's co-editor with Derek Gladwin of a special issue on Irish studies and the environmental humanities, our topic, of the Canadian Journal of Irish Studies, published in 2018. With Catherine Lang and Sinead Mooney of Edna O'Brien, New Critical Perspectives, with Lisa Coletta of Wild Colonial Girl, Essays on Edna O'Brien, and with Take Foley of Ireland and India, Colonies, Culture and Empire. And all three were published in 2006, which seems to have been an especially productive year. Maureen's latest book, Edna O'Brien and the Art of Fiction, was recently published in October 2021, and it has already received a lot of critical acclaim and praise. Today, Maureen, who's also known as the Irish eco-critic on Twitter, will explore with us the poetry of Moya Cannon in our workshop on environmental humanities and Irish studies. So Maureen, we are delighted that you are joining us today, if only virtually, and we are very much looking forward to your incentive talk and to the following discussion. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ina, and thank you everybody who has made this possible there at University of Wutzburg, Katrien, Maria, Lena, who I think really is the conduit, the original conduit of all this, Antonios, Anne-Sophie, and Bianca. So actually, Katrien said a lot about the environmental humanities that I now don't need to say, so I can skip ahead a little bit just to talk a bit about, I suppose, Irish studies and its relationship to the environmental humanities. My own work, I mean, I organize international conferences and transdisciplinary workshops here in UCC and elsewhere. And I look at the kind of work in Irish studies that is responding to the global crisis by considering the ideological origins of the Western belief that dominance over nature has been somehow divinely ordained, as well as how Irish cultural production can figure in the effort to dismantle such dangerously anthropocentric beliefs. Irish studies has always, by its very nature, been embedded in transdisciplinarity. In his 2001 book, Space and the Irish Cultural Imagination, Jerry Smith has suggested, quote, the study of the relationship between culture and environment overlaps significantly with the study of Irish cultural history. And I would add that Ireland's own history of colonialism, both as victims and perpetrators of colonial occupation, make Irish culture maybe particularly amenable to this kind of analysis. And some of the most kind of current iterations of environmental humanities consider the Anthropocene to be in a continuum with practices of dispossession and genocide. And I am kind of paraphrasing a recent article by Heather Davis and Zoe Todd on decolonizing the Anthropocene. And this particular approach, for example, could have implications for studies of the Irish famine. And you mentioned there, Ina, that special issue that Derek and I co-edited came from the Canadian Journal of Irish Studies. And up until about the last decade or so, most kind of eco-critical environmental humanities work in Irish studies was really being done by scholars in North America. It's very recently that it's kind of something that is building quite a lot of momentum here in Ireland. And it just so happened, I've been waiting for this, and it just came in yesterday's post, so I didn't have a chance to really look at it yet, but this journal, Irish Pages, is on the Anthropocene, this particular. So I think we are definitely catching up and then some in the way that Irish culture seems to do. I remember the first time I saw a mobile phone was on somebody on a tractor in a small village in Ireland decades ago. So the Irish have a way of sort of leaping ahead. So as was mentioned, my talk will specifically look at the poetry of Moya Cannon, a contemporary Irish writer. Her work is, oh wait, I didn't put my, I didn't put my screen on. I almost forgot. I was so excited to get started. Right, so this is what's happening. Is that, can everybody see that? Yes, okay, now I can see it too. All right, so there's Moya Cannon, erstwhile neighbor of ours in Galway, so we miss her though. She is often the subject, her work is often the subject of eco-critical, ecofeminist scholarship. I'll be looking at a number of her works, including some of her most recent poetry, which was actually written during the pandemic. And these poems in oblique and direct ways address the current climate catastrophe. But long before the pandemic, Cannon has been writing poetry that deals with loss and death, encouraging us to revise our relationship to these phenomena, lessons of urgency in these challenging days. As the back of her very recently published collected poems observes, the immediacy of our response to the beauty of our exploited planet inspires many of Moya Cannon's poems. Her poetry powerfully evokes our embeddedness in the ultimately deathless material world. The work captures and resides in intensely present moments, free of the oppressive need to organize our perceptions or penetrate the mystery of our interaction with our earth others. Cannon's poetry immerses us in the joy of belonging in the world, even amidst destruction, pain, and loss. So I'll just give you a little background. Ina indicated that people maybe would not be familiar with Cannon's work. So she was born in Donegal in 1956. She moved to Galway in the early 70s to go to university at National University of Ireland, Galway, and had lived there then really until just a couple of years ago. She's relocated to Dublin. She's the author of 7 poetry collections, and I'm including the latest collected poems. In the last section of the collected poems, there are 5 poems written during lockdown, the very early days of the pandemic. And as I said, some of the poems address that directly, particularly maybe in the closing stanzas. And I include some of those closing stanzas here. So Taking the Brunt of It starts out looking at daffodils or narcissi, whichever you want to call them, in the park, that are somehow bearing the brunt of winter or spring storms. Like they're being bent down, but they're not, and they're getting a little ragged, but they're persevering. And then it moves toward the end there to this storm. And by this storm, she means the pandemic. And in this storm, which rips across the world, which has grounded air fleets and emptied teeming streets, it's the older ones who sit, heads nodding in tall-backed chairs, who try to smile into the phone. So many different beloved ones who take the brunt of it. Delete Contact Card is a poem about the recent death of friends. Those of you who read the Christine Cusick article, you see the references to Tim Robinson, the writer and map maker. He and his wife, Maureen, died in April of 2020. They were very close friends with Moya, and they were some of the people who she was thinking of in this poem, which concludes, "What we do know now, better than we used to, is the worth of that honeycomb of hours spent laughing and talking, the sun-washed, unwasted hours of human contact." The environmental implications of the pandemic are acknowledged in the concluding stanza of A Song at Imbolc. Now, Imbolc is one of the 4 kind of pagan Celtic seasons. Imbolc is the beginning of spring, Bealtaine is the beginning of summer, Lunasa is the beginning of autumn, and Samhain is the beginning of winter. And these are organized by length of days, so they have to do with the solstice and the equinox. Pardon me. Imbolc falls on the 1st of February. It seems like a cold time for spring to begin, but it is also the feast day of Saint Bridget, who in some accounts is a Christianized version of a local goddess. And this is how the poem concludes. Bridget, goddess, druidess of oak or saint, a girl who gifted her father's sword to a beggar for bread. We who have wounded the engendering seas and earth beg you to teach us again before it grows too late, your neglected, painstaking arts of nature and care. Of nurture and care. This particular audience probably does not need me to explain eco-criticism or ecofeminism, but I am going to briefly review a few key concepts. In Simian, Cyborgs, and Women, Donna Haraway talks about the nature-culture divide as a, quote, major source of ancient and modern justifications of domination, especially the domination based on differences seen as natural, given, inescapable, and therefore moral. And as you probably all know, in kind of reaction to this, she coined the single word nature culture. In the book Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher talks about this idea of the given, the reality principle, which he points out, quote, constitutes the highest form of ideology, the ideology that presents itself as empirical fact, biological economic necessity, and that we tend to perceive as non-ideological. It is precisely here that we should be most alert to the functioning of ideology. So ideologies based on the nature culture division are behind all Western structures of discipline, including technologies of knowledge and power. As Haraway has told us, these kind of naturalized knowledges are incorporated covertly into technologies of social control, not liberation. and the idea of kind of a scientific objective truth as holding up a sort of unproblematic, unbiased mirror to nature, represents nature as somehow ahistoric, static, inert, just kind of a subject of inquiry. And Cannon's poetry, on the other hand, imbues the non-human world with agency as well as a deep and independent, that is independent of human history, as we will see. Rosie Braidotti I was going to say she was here in UCC, but I guess she was here in UCC the way I'm there in Wutzburg. She gave a talk here in UCC virtually earlier in the year on post-human ethics, and including the observation, appeals to the human tend to be discriminatory. Of course, there's a long tradition of relegating women to the nature side of the nature-human divide, the non-human side of the non-human-human binary. Women's inferiority has traditionally been alleged and justified by appropriating them to nature, an appropriation that colonialism has also practiced on its racial and cultural others. And this is one of the reasons why I think Irish studies really is a great place to think about environmental humanities topics. The ideological equation of women and children with nature, and especially with non-human animals, of course, connects them to the body and its limits, including mortality, which is despised in the classic Western tradition, which privileges immortality and transcendence seen as masculine qualities. So while clearly I've been giving you a little review of the basic tenets of ecofeminism, the most recent evolution, which you may be aware of in this particular area, is materialist feminism, and it draws on the work of people who have been in the field for quite a while, such as Haraway. Her post-gender cyborg is very important, as is Stacey Alaimo's transcorporeality. And of course, both of these are very much dependent on the even earlier work by Deleuze and Guattari, particularly the idea of the body without organs from 1,000 Plateaus, which is a challenge to certain fundamental thinking that human subjectivity is constituted as a kind of a closed system, that the body is an independent kind of entity. In Deleuze and Guattari, the body without organs stands for contingency and fluidity, and allows us, it's helpful anyway, in reassessing the body as a kind of simply human effect that has nothing to do with non-human others. So what distinguishes work in this field is a desire to reconceive and reorientate traditionally hierarchical relationships, to establish, according to Val Plumwood, in order to kind of counter this othering, a depolarizing reconception of non-human nature, which recognizes the denied space of our hybridity, continuity, and kinship, and is also able to recognize in suitable context the difference of the non-human, but in a non-hierarchical way. So denying and exposing asymmetrical dualisms, to argue for a culture of difference that reveals the fallacy of likeness, including self-similarity, bringing into significance an open and inclusive range of objects, in the words of Timothy Clark, a new willingness to embrace the fully inhuman in all of its variability and volatility. And that's from his essay, Geopolitics and the Disaster of the Anthropocene. And of course, these others aren't just non-human animals, but inanimate, invisible elements, minerals deep in the earth, the ocean, wind, even rubbish and pollution. So this kind of horizontal, dispersed, multiple conception of subjectivity really mounts a critique engaging with the Western subject, including issues of embodiment. So rather than seeing the human body as this kind of inviolate whole, thinking about the ways in which technology, weather, food, even the DNA of our bodies it's not even 50% of what we have here in this thing is human. And I'm quoting Haraway when she talks about the body as a, quote, collective and historical artifact constituted by human as well as organic and technological unhuman actors. And that's in The Promises of Monsters. As was mentioned, a good deal of my own work focuses on the figure of the non-human animal in Irish women's writing. The animal, like the Irish and like woman, according to Sherry Ortner, is seen as, quote, lower on the scale of transcendence than man. And that's from her canonical 1974 essay, Is Female to Male as Nature is to Culture. rendering otherness through the figure of the animal, whether otherness is determined by gender, race, class, ethnicity, able-bodiedness, is a long-standing practice subtending numerous patriarchal mechanisms of domination. In literature, the animal raises the question of what counts as language, a question of significance for Western notions of the subject. We like to think of language as what distinguishes us from other life forms, and this is an idea that Cannon's poetry challenges. I think the Cusick piece kind of engages with issues of the inadequacy of language as well. The natural world in Cannon's work is often in a state of what appears to our limited human vision as decay or decline, sometimes as a result of millennia of human interaction. In Cannon's poetry, however, brokenness, destruction, and death, as figured by our irresolvable relationship to the material, non-human world, clears space for creativity and renewal by connecting us to the non-human, including the non-human that resides within the human. Dirt, death, and decay both determine and undermine the self, and through this dynamic provide access to the liminality that is essential to creative imagination. The generation of life requires decay, is fertilized by rot and manure. Rosie Braidotti argues, quote, that death is overrated. The ultimate subtraction is, after all, only another phase in a generative process, end quote. Propagation and degeneration occupy the same continuum. Gay Fawkes, in her book Ethics of Waste, How We Relate to Rubbish, talks about this social construction of waste, these constructions of waste and dirt as enabling the imposition of ethics and order, and thereby forestalling, quote, the possibility of unnerving conflation between nature and culture, subject and object, and what we call persons and what we call things. So there are two poems that I'm going to be focusing on from the 90s. Foundations from the 1990 collection, Or, a poem in which human and non-human history intersect for a moment and are united in their shared vulnerability. And from the 1997 collection, The Parchment Boat, a poem that Cusick mentions or discusses as well, the poem Scríab. And if you have read the Cusick piece, you know that Scríab is the Irish word for write, which is also the word for scratch. And the poem features an undead, unborn bird as the figure for writing, poetry, knowledge, beginnings, and for the necessary impossibility of all these things. But to go back to foundations, okay. Digging foundations for a kitchen, 1.5 feet below the old concrete, they open a midden of seashells. This was once called kitchen, the poor man's meat, salty, secretive, gathered at neap tide. Blue mussels creaked as a hand twisted them from the cluster. Limpets were banged off with a stone, lifted with the blade. The clams, deep breathing in wet sand, gave a mark to the spade. Backs ached, reaping the cold and succulent harvest. How many were consumed? A shovelful, 2 shovelfuls, 6 barrow loads dug out and dumped. The midden runs under the wall into the neighbor's yard. The builder goes home, joking that he's found gold. In a battered barrow under the June evening sun, the last shovelfuls turn palest gold. They speak in silent sympathy with all that has been exiled, killed, and hidden, then exhumed, vulnerable again in the air of another age. The taciturn clams break their silence to say, dig us out if you need to, position the steel, raise the concrete walls, but when your shell is complete, remember that your life, no less than ours, is measured by the tides of the sea and is unspeakably fragile. There's a lot to unpack here, but I'm going to start with the word midden, which is about 2/3 of the way up from the bottom on the right there, which, as the poem indicates, refers to the kitchen midden, that is a dump of domestic waste. In Irish gardens, if you do any digging at all, you are going to find a midden of some kind. We have a collection of ancient bottles that seems to keep accumulating. Before there were like municipal garbage collection, people buried their waste in back gardens. We find the word in other poems, such as the poem At Dog's Bay from the 2019 collection, Donegal Tarantella. And I won't read the poem, you can read it yourself there, but in this poem, it's natural erosion, storms that have chewed off half a row of dunes. It's not human activity that reveals a loan of midden, a charcoal stroke across a page of clean time, burnt winkles, burnt bones, burnt wood. And I'm looking at these poems together because both imagine a moment of revelation of hidden connections and parallels. The long-forgotten humans who created the unburied Midden in a Dog's Bay have been superseded by a new city, a twittering cliffside pueblo, where sand martins, and that's a little sand martin in her pueblo there in the picture, where sand martins now live, brushing the sky with their quick calligraphy. And I'll return to that image of calligraphy and the charcoal stroke later. The image of the midden, though not the word itself, also appears in the poem Shards, which opens, "My garden is a graveyard for plates and cups. Each year's digging draws up a new hoard, and there's a democracy in all the brokenness." And I love that phrase of democracy in all the brokenness. We are all partial, broken, fragile pieces of a mosaic in which each piece is equally necessary to creating a healthy, functioning whole. I'm going to come back to foundation. So there is a certain derogation implicit in the word midden. It's definitely evoked in the joke that digging up old shells is like discovering buried treasure. The builder's joke, however, is belied by the poem itself, which grants the shells a golden glow when they catch the June evening sun. And they do so at a moment in the text when they are about to give up their treasure. Several worlds coincide in the poem. The modern speaker, who's doing that thing that so many Irish people did during the Celtic Tiger. She's extending and modernizing her kitchen. There are the previous inhabitants of this former working class dwelling, which is why it has such a small kitchen, a very small working class house. The poor who supplemented their diet with secretive catches of shellfish and whose backs ached in digging that food out of the sand, just as the modern builder's back aches digging them up once again. David Farrier, in his recent book, Anthropocene Poetics, says of the Anthropocene that, quote, distant pasts and futures flow through the present in all manner of sometimes surprising ways, end quote. These two groups of human animals, separated in time, are united by the only beings who are given the power of direct speech in the poem, the taciturn clams. And of course, that's an irony. I don't know if other languages have that cliche of, silent as a clam. But and I will come back to that closing speech, which is the treasure that the clams vouchsafe there. I want to look at, before I do that though, I want to look at other non-human, non-linguistic communication. Earlier, the clams have spoken in a way before they are given speech at the end with their deep breathing in wet sand at the top of the page there, which shows where you want to put your spade if you're looking to dig them up. Older human traditions enabled the reading of natural signs, and this is a facility of which fewer and fewer of us are capable. This kind of access to the extra linguistic is the work of poetry, which relies on expressive powers beyond the narrowly legible, the denotative words on the page, more like the charcoal stroke or the calligraphy of bird's flight in the poem At Dog's Bay. Images which generously redefine not only what we mean by language, but what constitutes writing. Cannon's poetry regularly exceeds the human limitations of what counts as language and writing in order to listen attentively and respectfully to silenced voices and to thereby communicate the truth of experience, much of which lies outside of narrow anthropocentric understandings of the linguistic. And Cusick also talks about the kind of the limits of accommodation of the traditionally linguistic. Another example of applying pressure to the idea of language is found in the poem Our Words from the 2007 collection Carrying the Songs. That should be songs. I don't know why it says stones. This poem begins, our words are cart ruts back into our guttural histories. They are rabbit tracks printed in the morning snow on a headland. They are otter runs urgent between the fresh and salt water. They are Dunland tracks at the tide's edge. They will be erased by the next wave, but in the meantime, they assure us that we are not alone, that we are heirs to all the treasure which words have ever netted. So our words are no better than, no different in any important way from rabbit tracks, otter runs, or Dunland tracks. And a Dunland is a kind of shorebird that runs along the surf like a sandpiper. All temporary, fleeting, destined to be wiped away and forgotten, but for that very reason, precious, a treasure. If we look again at what the clams tell us at the end of Foundations, they are speaking in sympathy with all that has been exiled, killed and hidden, then exhumed, vulnerable again in the air of another age. This could be referring to the written human word as much as to other non-human artifacts and human artifacts being remembered in a kind of frozen, silent way, kind of museumized as an exhibit to be contemplated, may be a less desirable fate than oblivion. The value of the ephemeral is emphasized here. The clams say, as you erect your bulwark against oblivion, where am I here? Remember that your life, no less than ours, is measured by the tides of the sea and is unspeakably fragile. The fragility is what connects us. Because we are each of us a kind of communal assemblage, as noted earlier, individuality is an illusion. We are dependent on every other part of the assemblage, precariously perched in the world, trembling at the edge of oblivion, which for Cannon and other artists is the space where creativity is possible, where it is most potently realized, where treasure is both discovered and made. Braidoti argues that death is the inhuman inside us. Making friends with the impersonal necessity of death is an ethical way of installing oneself in life as a transient, slightly wounded visitor. The proximity to death suspends life not into transcendence, but rather into the radical imminence of just alive here and now for as long as we can take. So again, radical imminence, the ephemeral, the transitory. And this sounds very much like Cannon's poetry to me, the richness of living in an awareness of our proximity to death. And the point is vividly made in Screeb, the next poem I want to look at. Start again from nothing and scrape, since scraping is now part of us. The sheep's track, the plow's track are marked onto the page. The pen's scrape cuts a path on the hill. But today I brought back 3 bones of a bird, eaten before it was hatched and spat, or shat out with its own broken shell to weather on the north cliffs of Hoy. The small bleached bones of a fulmar or gannet have nothing to tell. They have known neither hunger nor flight and have no understanding of the darkness which came down and killed. Tracks run to an end. Sheep get lost in the wet heather. There are things which can be neither written nor spoken nor read, then wings which cannot be mended, too fragile for scraping. The bones hold in their emptiness the genesis of the first blown note. Again, as in the poem At Dog's Bay, we have a radical equivalence posited here between the sheep's track, the plow's track, the pen's scrape, non-human and human traces of journeys, of attention, of desire. The animalized bodily act of scraping is the act of creating a mark on the page. The human pen is making a path on a hill of no more transcendent value than the sheep's track scoring that same incline. And I don't know how many people here would be familiar with Finnegan's Wake, the James Joyce novel, but in that novel, Biddy the hen is scratching in a midden and therefore one of the authors of the work. Another recurring image from Cannon's oeuvre is the railway track, and it appears here in the poem. The tracks here run to an end, run out without reaching a destination. In the San Martins at Shanganagh, the railroads chiseled, it's at the very bottom there, chiseled granite blocks are long fallen to the shingle, corners smoothed by a century of spring tides. As in Foundations, a long lost human population appears here a few lines above. The railway is there to carry day trippers in straw hats and starched frocks along a track, which now crafts imagination. Images of futile human endeavor are not symbols of tragedy, but are simply fleeting structures like the shells in Foundation or the frail houses in this poem on San Martins, which in a later stanza are described as not lasting the rain. But to come back to Screeb. The bird's bones function as elusive repository of the lyrical, the very last words, the first blown note. But here Genesis is rendered paradoxically as emptiness, recalling the void of oblivion that I was talking about earlier. The unborn bird troubles the meaning of birth, death, and representation. The image of potential but balked flight embodied in an unborn bird figures as the specter haunting language, the necessary loss and pain that gives birth to the poem. The figure of the unborn bird presents the reader with a kind of paradoxically productive failure. everything in nature is potentially a paradox to our impoverished way of organizing experience. And of course, all the theories that we're talking about, up to and including materialist feminism, are really just rediscoveries of knowledge that traditional cultures were very much immersed in, but which have been under capital, have been suppressed and even forgotten. We are presented with the failure of our culture to find accurate language to describe that which has never been born, when in the Western ideological tradition, only certain states of being can be, and certain states of being must be included in this sacred category of life. And I don't really have time to talk about Giorgio Agamben's ideas about bare life, but biopower and the biopolitical is something that is kind of in the background here. This kind of reductively dualistic understanding of what counts as ontology has been against this. Jacques Derrida has posited hauntology in his book Spectres of Marx. The spectral, according to this theory, disrupts our certainty about the distinction between being and non-being, between presence and absence. In her essay, The Death of Nature and the Apotheosis of Trash, Patricia Jaeger sees, quote, interest in detritus as a refusal of the similar, end quote, including the self-similarity that's necessary to subject formation predicated on masculinity. The kind of illusion of equilibrium that images, such as those in this poem, disturb. The bird's non-being undoes the act of discourse, defined by the impossibility of definition as language hesitates before it, stops and starts again. The unborn bird is inassimilable waste, not only in the psychological sense of kind of the Christavan abject, but inassimilable even to language hovering between presence and absence. Derrida's hauntology replaces our confident conclusions about being and presence with the ghost or specter that is neither alive nor dead. And this can also be linked to Alaimo's transcorporeality. This in-between state undermines dualisms of life and death, human and non-human, body and mind, culture and nature. The disruption or erasure of dualisms, including that distinguishing life from death, is connected to Cannon's treatment of time. In Time Travels, Feminism, Nature, and Power, Elizabeth Gross has talked about time being this itself being a kind of paradoxical nowhere that opens up a divergence. Death is a phenomenon in time that opens up to divergence and not a conclusion. The bird in the poem was never alive, so it never technically died. But as many theorists have argued, a corpse can be considered as alive as anything else in nature. We have just been conditioned culturally to think of corpse as waste, as again, Christavan abject explains. And in Deleuze and Guattari's Body Without Organs, quote, not a dead body, but a living body that is all the more alive and teeming once it has blown apart the organism and its organization. The already digested bones in this poem have been and continue to be put to use, providing physical and poetic sustenance. They're not properly dead, but exist in an uncanny nowhere. The poem starts again from nothing, first words. As negative, a productive start as the emptiness that concludes the poem, denying a kind of teleological progress. Tracks run to an end, lines of poetry, lines of thought, lives all run to an end, but start again. The theme of the illegible emerges here when the speaker says there are things which can be neither written nor spoken nor read. This negative awareness is also evident when we are told that the bones have nothing to tell. In a discussion of the function of the non-human animal in art, Steve Baker argues that, quote, humans have typically wanted things of animals, wanting them to be meaningful, wanting to be consoled by those meanings. In much of contemporary Irish women's poetry, the non-human is not made to perform, not even to act as a metaphor in a traditional way, but as a source of inspiring mystery and inviolable otherness, independent of our need for meaning. Many of the poems I've discussed, and many more besides, in Cannon's work feature birds. If this poem is drawing an equivalence between bones, detritus, and poetry, does it mean something that it's a woman poet doing this, capturing in her associative net suggestions of dirt, death, and decay? Hélène Sixou has claimed to be, quote, interested in a chain of association and signifiers composed of birds, women, and writing. Her discussion draws on biblical condemnations of the unclean, which includes birds, and the category she's talking about is imund, which she translates as abominable, literally out of the world, an idea she wants to liberate from its association with abhorrence into a condition of jouissance. If I gather these beings to talk about them in the same way, if I am worried by the fate of birds and women, it is because I have learned that not many people, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, can really love, tolerate, or understand a certain kind of writing. I am using women and birds as synonyms, imund, to be unclean with joy out of the mundus world. Why are birds unclean? Because, the because which rules our lives, that is, certain ideologies. The emphasis here is an ostensibly negative one on the unclean and the unruly, but it is transvalued into a source of celebration and creativity. The presence of non-human animals in literature always poses dangers to the symbolic order, potentially refusing legibility. The self-conscious deployment of the non-human animal, especially an unborn bird, as in the Cannon poem, is a figure for the productive failures and fragile silences of women's writing, engaging with the limits of representation and language, the inherent violence of metaphor. This engagement with the impossibility of unmediated representation is the kind of mimetic crisis in which the animal is often called on to intervene, especially by women writers who do not wish to foreclose multiple possibilities for the making of meaning. The animal's uncanny effect on figuration, on language itself, is intensified if it is the corpse of an animal, particularly as in the poem, One Not Yet Fully Formed. What Scribe suggests is that undoing, unbecoming, degeneration, and non-being are essential to presence. And I'm going to return to Braidati's UCC talk. We are entities whose joy and pleasure consists in persevering, in being, a contention that is potentially fraught with power relations, but not naivete, but deeply stoical, radical imminence. I am part of this life on this planet. In this particular moment, my responsibility is to take accountability for the multiple ecologies of belonging and inject affirmation into it. And this to me is the work of artistic production in general, but perhaps especially poetry, which, as I've been saying, captures and resides in intensely present moments. Art's unique relationship to time is also significant in this context. In the words of Farrier, time gives a poem its form in the interplay of repetition and rupture, in the tension between order, rhythms, and their variation, as well as between the poem's syntax and the rhythms of everyday language. Poetry allows us to approach the question of what it means to live in the folding and unfolding of deep pasts and deep futures, in which difference is the shifting ground on which connection takes place. Time, of course, is what gives form to both life and death. Poetry immerses us in the joy of belonging in the world, even amidst destruction, pain, and loss, the reciprocal relationship between life and non-life. And I'm going to wrap up by giving the last words to Cannon, again, quoting from the end of one of the new poems, and this one is Pascal, about the 17th century French philosopher, theologian, and mathematician, Blaise Pascal. If we consider Cannon to be a poet of the Anthropocene, as I do, this work is one which addresses Farrier's claim that a, quote, poetics of the Anthropocene can help us appreciate in new ways what it means to live enfolded in deep time. The poem's closing is also insists on the regeneration that's inherent in every ending. So the poem begins by thinking about Pascal, who understood so much, standing in awe of what he could see of the heavens, but he could only see so much of the heavens. And he was able to kind of extrapolate possibilities that actually have come to pass with the technologies that have been developed since his time. But we, who grew up with reason enthroned, who have learned how to weigh a star and measure a billion years of light, who have blurred the plush black of your silver-studded night with our small, insistent lamps, we wonder still what lies beyond the rim of a universe which may have no edge at all, in either time, in either space or time, which may fold back upon itself in deepest mystery. As above and around us, planets spin out their very long or their very short days, as red giants, white dwarves, and supernovae grow, implode, burn out, collide, yet continue to come to birth. Thank you.
Well, to shift my my view here. Thank you very much, Maureen, for this really inspiring talk, and particularly for the very to the point readings of the poetry. I wish we would deal with poetry much more frequently than we usually do in our daily lives, both as readers and as academics. I actually have quite a few questions myself, but I don't want to actually start the round of question and discussion, and would open the floor for the audience, the participants of this workshop out there, wherever you are. So the floor is open for comments, thoughts, questions that you have, thoughts that you would want to share, comments you want to make. I know it's always difficult.
Hard to be the first one. No one wants to be
for someone to break the ice. So I keep babbling a little bit so people can make up their minds. And
Ina has a question.
Ina has a question. Lena has a question.
Lena and Ina.
Okay, Ina.
Yeah, this is it's certainly not a good question. I just try to an observation maybe. As you know, I'm not an expert in environmental humanities, but I have worked on historical fiction, and I was really intrigued by this idea of the Midden and how it might also serve as, you know, what Foucault calls these layers of history, how it unravels earlier layers beneath the surface, which I find very interesting. And I was wondering whether this is also something, certainly it is, I guess, that Moya Cannon wants to invoke these not just, you know, the earlier natural times, but also, you know, the earlier times in which humans lived with nature.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's a lot of that in her poetry. Of course, I'm going blank. There's one poem in particular that just leapt to mind, except not the name of it, where if I keep talking, it'll come to me. There, an old, and this kind of comes back to Bridget too, there's an old holy well that has fallen out of use, and holy wells in Ireland would have been, again, there's a kind of a deeper time, a pagan time, but into Christian era, they would have been visited by people, you know, looking for special intercessions and cures and things, and they're often, you know, sort of little prayers or charms or all kinds of objects left. And in the poem, the speaker comes across this, and everything's gone green from disuse, and the Virgin is tipped over and broken. And they kind of, she and her friends kind of jump into the sea, which is not far away, and the water has been, she thinks about the water flowing from the holy well and being kind of a different form of being blessed. And of course, holy wells are very much, you know, again, before, if we think about when, you know, Catholicism was not allowed to be practiced publicly, the kind of landscape worship that was typical of Irish Catholicism. And there's all kinds of layers of colonial history, of religion, of the deep pagan past, nature-based worship, even though supposedly Christian. This is one of the things that the official Catholic Church did not like about Irish worship. It seemed too pagan and had to be reformed in that way. So yeah, no, I think that like in some of the poems I was looking at there are the clams, there are the working class people who used to live in this house, and there's the modern, you know, Celtic tiger woman who wants a nice open kitchen, you know, that looks very cutting edge. So yeah, no, it's in a lot of the poetry, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Also, I think I was thinking of with regard to the literature of the palimpsest, when you know the scribbling that was invoked, the calligraphy. So this is also kind of so layers seems to be something that I, kind of saw referenced in the poetry.
Absolutely, and I think connecting it to kind of the marks that animals make also connects it to bodies. So it's bodies in the past. It's not just kind of abstract kind of records, but a kind of a visceral, embodied connection to those layers. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ina, for the question.
Lena is next.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question that links back a bit more generally to what you said in the beginning about the connection of Irish studies and thinking about the environment, and especially this background of dispossession and of colonial history. And I'm particularly interested and couldn't really wrap my head around the relation of the global and the local in that context, because much of the Irish literature I know is very grounded in particular places and particular spaces. And also when I read your introduction to that special issue and sort of the way that the environmental humanities came more to the fore after the Celtic Tiger sort of led into a big recession, the focus was still very much on local sort of environmental degradation, if I understood you correctly. So maybe you could say a few more words about this shift to the more global perspective, which we could see in the last poem, Pascal, which you just showed before we moved on to the discussion.
Yeah, and I just remembered the name of the poem I'm talking about is The Holy Well. As I talked, I remembered the name. But yes, so somebody I would recommend her work, which is really helpful in what you're talking about, this kind of global positioning of Irish environmental humanities. She's in UCD and her name is Sharae, Sharae Deckard, Deckard. And she talks a lot about, she writes quite a lot about the ways in which the Irish economy, the globalized Irish economy, very much encourages the exploitation of Ireland as this kind of virgin territory that businesses can come in and basically despoil because no one else has been doing it. So come on in, we've got a nice blank page for you to smirch with. There's a massive controversy right now with these giant data centers that we are welcoming with open arms. So yeah, come on in. So Shari's work is really excellent because she really delves into all the policy and all stuff that I could not imagine reading, but she does a great job of distilling it and then putting it in this cultural context. It's the kind of documents that we don't read, that we don't even think about. And it's really important, I think, that someone is looking at that and thinking about the ways in which it impacts the environment here in Ireland from all these international influences that are very much, we're one of the headquarters, of Google and all of these kinds of businesses. And one of the selling points often is that, we have a virtually pristine environment. So yeah, her work is very interesting in that context.
Thank you.
Antonios.
Thank you also very much for the talk. I did learn a lot. I was just very intrigued by this concept of a deathless world where you basically don't cease to exist, you keep existing, but in another way. So it's basically a life or a process of constant transformation from one state into the other. And in this way, we could even say nature, landscape, the environment isn't killed, but transformed. Now, the way in which it is transformed is, of course, not something that we should do. But still, I felt this bit of tension when you read out one of the latest poems where Cannon processed her grief of losing her friends. In theory, they didn't die. They transformed into memories or they transformed into bones. I don't know. But I was just wondering about this tension that I felt between we live in an essentially deathless world, so there's a certain sense of tranquility that is kind of juxtaposed by this, I wouldn't say fear, but maybe the sense of loss.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's, what is that? I'm not a scientist, but is it the first law of thermodynamics or something about how energy can't be destroyed, right? So it's just moving into different forms. And yeah, I think there is a tension there because, you know, I suppose, especially when you're older, like trying to kind of be less sort of focused on the self and self-absorbed, and realizing that sort of my individual death and suffering is not necessarily that significant. But I do think there is, you know, a lot of recent work I think I've started 7 sentences there without finishing any of them, but I think about Donna Haraway, about living, you know, like living in with the mess, right? And this idea that, well, this is what we've got. We have to find a way of appreciating it, respecting it, and understanding that there are just certain things that are completely out of our control. And I think you're right. There is a real tension there between kind of loss and pain, and also, you know, kind of accepting the fact that, trying to kind of maybe translate that pain into an acceptance of the fact that there is no death except in the most, you know, kind of solipsistic, individualistic sense. Now, I have recently lost one of the most important people in my life, so I have really been trying to do this myself. And, you know, as an individual, as a feeling human being, and of course, you know, it matters, your own feelings matter, of course. I think there is always that tension if you're a thinking person, and trying to, you know, not be always kind of turned inwards. And that's, I suppose, one of the lessons of environmental humanities, is to have this global perspective. And it goes back, I suppose, to Lena's really important observation that so much of Irish literature does seem to be about Ireland, and it's only kind of recently starting to kind of look in these other directions, and kind of see Ireland as something that is just a, you know, a cog in a bigger machinery. I don't know if I've answered your question, Antonius. It's a complicated one to answer.
Sorry for that. Yeah,
No,
thank you very much.
It's a good question. No, it's a good question. I think you're right about that dynamic. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the interesting answer.
Maria, if I may chime in, because one of my points is actually directly connected to this. As I was listening to your reading and talking about the poetry, what I realized, I was, actually thinking, are these actually elegies? I've been thinking about elegy a lot recently as a form, and the poems are not exactly elegies, but they certainly have this elegiac tone to them. And what is definitely there is this aspect of lamentation. There is, a lament about something that is being lost, and even if we I don't even know whether it's rational if we say, I think it was your formulation, the ultimately deathless material world. If we say there is no death as such, there's only transition into a different form. I wonder whether that is, is the consolation that elegy also provides, actually, with its classic pattern, actually, of, lamentation of the death of an important object, person, the praise, and then consolation, basically. And it seems to me that the poetry that you read and Cannon's poetry, almost in a religious sense, has this quality of an elegy, in that it finds an alternative to the way death has been perceived, both in the Judeo-Christian, or maybe just Christian tradition, but also in the tradition of the Enlightenment, where death was basically ignored. And so, when you talked about alternatives, and much of what we think about now is only a rediscovery of approaches to the world, of ways of knowing that have been buried by modern traditions. It seems to me that her poetry, kind of via elegy, it's teaching us a new, perhaps quasi-religious way of dealing with death, of making making sense of death. And so this is more a comment or a thought than a question, but maybe you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about the poetry as very elegiac. And I suppose that poem, The Holy Well, that came to my mind when I was, it's very, as I said, like these layers of spirituality or spiritual practice of the pagan, there's the Christian, and then they are literally flowing as a kind of baptism to the swimmers coming together as a kind of, kind of a blessing, and when I read that poem, I think of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner and, blessing the writhing things in the sea. I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it. And I thank you for that. I made a note of that. I also want to just mention a really helpful, I did not know about this poet or this poem in the comments. Míchéal, I'm not sure how to say his last name, hUanacháin, Pensées Apres Pascal. It's interesting that Pascal comes back into it, the power of science and human knowledge to do ill. That's a great reference, and I thank you for that. I just wanted to mention that because I was afraid it might get away from me because it just popped up there. Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. That's great.
Okay, Maria.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, first, thank you for the great talk, in which I also learned a lot. I have a very basic question, actually, on 2 points that you mentioned. You mentioned posthumanism and gender. And I think we all agree that posthumanism, in a way, is kind of a redefinition of our place, of humanity's place in the world, in which the human is only one life form among many. And if we get deeper into this kind of repositioning, how can gender issues help us in developing a theoretical and maybe also a philosophical approach responsive to our changing understanding of ourselves in the first place and the whole world? So how can we get this together? You mentioned it, but you didn't really get deeper into the combination of these two.
Yes. Okay. All right. That's a very easy question. So,
Okay.
I talk about, Irish women's writing, but I don't mean that in an essentialized way. In the same, like obviously race does not exist in any scientific way, but there are quite specific, experiences of the raced body in the world. So it's not that, so race exists in a social sense, and the way in which we think about gender now as something that, is kind of post Judith Butler, as something that is a construction and is, again, living in a sexed or a gendered body has particular implications and effects. But I think the more sophisticated way that we think about gender as a construct, even though it seems it's something quite difficult, I suppose I'm thinking about my own family. I have some trans young people in my family, and there are the older generation who are just blown away by this and cannot understand it. But this idea of the body as something that isn't fixed, stable, closed, not a closed system, that is something that has come into gender theory and queer theory and lived experience for people, and more acceptance, not enough acceptance, of course, but more acceptance. So I think that the ways in which, kind of from Judith Butler on, gender, at least in the modern era, that gender's kind of deconstruction can have a huge impact on the way that we think about our bodily selves and our connection to all other bodies and beings, that there is this kind of, it's a permeable and labile sort of envelope that isn't fixed in time, historically kind of determined, but something that can always be open to new formations. And that's very much, I think, important. And we're thinking about like new materialist, post-human ideas about our relationship to the natural world, so-called. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it is, in a way, kind of a redefinition of how we define it. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, just for all of you out there, as you probably know, I don't see all of you. So if you want to say something, ask a question, just raise your digital hand. Oh, there's Ashley. Thank you. But, raise the digital hand. That's easier for me to see it. I know that some people are also watching the chat. So if you don't feel comfortable asking a question into the microphone, you might also want to just put your question into the chat, and some of the assistants will then relate your question to Maureen. Okay, but Ashley, it's your turn now.
Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Maureen. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the talk. And I want to apologize. I missed the start of it. I actually had some internet problems, but I see in the chat that I see it's being recorded. So I'm excited to go back and watch the start. So I apologize if my question touches on something you might have talked at the beginning, but I was wondering if you have any thoughts on a relationship between Moya Cannon's poetry and feminism. I guess because and especially from the McElroy reading that we had, there seemed to be this implication that a lot of Irish women writers kind of have to deal with gender issues, whether they want to or not, because of a history of gendering the landscape. And I was interested in, like, when I was reading some of Cannon's poetry before this talk, I noticed she seems to be kind of applying some kind of feminist techniques without kind of it seeming like she's doing it, like kind of emphasis on embodied experience, situated knowledge, kind of relational experience, and more humble, modest, direct engagements with space and materiality. But yet when you read the poetry, it doesn't seem like this is a feminist piece. So I was interested if you have any thoughts on that, and what it could mean for Irish environmental humanities more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, yeah, I'm understanding the question. I mean, Moya is definitely a feminist, and, ecofeminists, often use her poetry in various readings and arguments. And I suppose not overtly or explicitly feminist, but I'm trying to think of poems of hers that would make the case, because there is an implicit, I suppose, like I'm thinking about Mary O'Malley, another kind of Galway-based poet, where in some ways, Irishness as historically being feminized, the Irish language as historically being feminized, and Moya, it does have quite a bit of Irish, and drops. She doesn't write poems in Irish, but there's Irish words frequently to be found throughout her poems. I think there is an implicit and yet conscious and deliberate understanding of the kind of feminization of certain social positionings and qualities that are part of what is being engaged with in the poem, without, I suppose, talking in an overt way. But then that's what poetry does. Poetry never kind of is giving a message in a kind of a tidy moral sense. But I think all the things that you're feeling are there. It's maybe the short answer, because she definitely is very conscious of, as I think Antonios or someone talked about that kind of the history. She's so conscious of the layers, or maybe that was Ina, the layers of history and kind of women's role. And I think it's even in foundations, the kitchen as a female space, and versus kind of the builders who are kind of joking about this stuff that the poet has a very different reading of, for example. I think it's all there, but maybe not kind of in an overt way. I don't know if that's helpful, but
thanks. No, it's great, because I thought that was very interesting and effective thing about her poetry, that she's seems to be employing these feminist methods, but isn't feeling like she has to self-disclose. So then you kind of focus more on the discoveries that she's making through this way of seeing. So I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, and Laoighseach, if I'm saying Laoiseach's name right, correctly, mentions Nuala O'Gonill's poetry, who I was thinking about her, but she is a very much feminist nature poet. I use her English translations when I teach, Irish ecofeminism quite a lot. And yeah, COVID-19 is definitely, I think, COVID-19 is there in the latest poems that I read some pieces from to just to comment on the chat. Sorry, thanks. Nice to see you, Ashley.
Okay, Hannah is next on my screen.
Thank you so much for this talk and for introducing us to this poetry. Maybe it was only an introduction for me, but I've already put it on my must order a copy immediately list. It was really meaningful to get to linger with these poems.
She's fantastic. She really is. I think she's very accessible too. Like which I feel poetry should be. Not that I'm nothing against difficult poetry, so to speak, but yeah.
I was really moved, and I also appreciate the connections that you've drawn for us between kind of a feminist materialism, feminist eco-criticism, and this work. And I was finding myself curious about whether you had ever engaged these poems within the context of maybe what Kate Sandilands would call like a queer ecologies that are being developed here. You mentioned a little bit sort of engagements with gender, and I'm wondering maybe more about engagements with I was thinking about Sarah Enser and this idea of kind of a cruising ecology, of moving through the world with a contact that is less predicated on kind of restraint and more predicated on this idea that, we can love whatever we can come into contact with. And I found contact to be this recurring theme, and the kinds of contacts that were being developed in this book struck me as maybe well suited to a sort of queer reading. And I was just wondering if you might speak to that.
I think that's brilliant. I mean, I haven't done it myself. And honestly, this is the first time I've kind of written anything about Moya's work. I teach a couple of the poems, but I haven't really thought about it. But I think that's absolutely, everything you say seems like just so perfect and absolutely right. Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I have nothing to say except I haven't done it, but I think you're right that the poetry is definitely amenable to that kind of analysis, for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, just thank you for that, Hannah. Thank you. Thanks.
Lena.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, goes into a completely different direction, how Moya's poetry, or how she as a writer is situated within the contemporary literary field. And that's basically because in much of the poetry, or when reading much of the poetry, and also when reading the Cusick piece, I was reminded so much of Sinead Morrissey and her poetry. Yeah. Especially in terms of this kind of the body as this Deleuzian notion you mentioned, the body without organs, because I think Sinead Morrissey has a huge amount of poems which are centered around anatomy and dissections. And then she's also got these Belfast poems where the city is kind of humanized and the city is breathing, and objects are being made into subjects. So I was just wondering whether you could say a bit about that, and maybe even about collaborations, poetic collaborations. Maybe this is something happening, which, yeah, I'm just really interested in this, because I was reminded of Sinead Morrissey's poetry in every second line.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I think Sinead Morrissey is not considered an eco-poet, but I certainly think that she is. I organized two conferences over the years on Ireland and eco-criticism. Moya was my poet in the first one, and Sinead was the poet in the second one. So I see them very much as engaged in the same kinds of issues, just in very different ways. I mean, we were talking about kind of accessibility versus difficulty. I think Sinead is maybe not as, it takes a lot more work, maybe kind of to get into Morrissey's poetry, which I think is brilliant. And, as I said, I teach this kind of ecofeminism class, and I teach both poets' work. I don't even know if they must know each other, but, Sinead is in Belfast, and yeah, and that touches on things that I very much just kind of brushed past in the talk, but I think that's really important in kind of, contemporary iterations of eco-criticism, which is to understand that like the built environment, and as I was saying, pollution and decay and the things that we don't think of as aesthetically pleasing in kind of a more traditional picturesque sense are definitely, part of the environment, part of the non-human, web in which we are all, implicated. So I don't know anything about collaborations. I just don't know. I don't know enough about what's happening there. I don't think Sinead Morrissey comes to the Republic very much at all. It's interesting. I don't know anything about the collaboration question. I just don't know. So I've got I'm not helpful with that, but both poets are, highly regarded in Ireland. And I mean, Sinead Morrissey has been winning some very, very impressive awards in the last few years. But I think the fact that you can have, the publication of a collected works when Moya is still relatively young, I think that says quite a lot about her work and the standing that she has at least in the Irish literary world, if she's not as well known as she should be outside of it.
I saw the digital hand of Antonius raised. Antonius, do you still want to?
I'm struggling a bit with the question itself because I don't know whether it leads to anywhere. I was just wondering, by giving nature a voice, by giving animals a voice, so humanizing nature and animals, isn't that in a way also then kind of colonizing them again? So taking over and deciding what this is really hard for me because I think
that's an important question that is being debated all the time when we're talking about literature and kind of speaking for, the subaltern, I kind of talk, kind of giving speech to, but I think if we think about foundations, there's a balance between the language that we can read, which is the marks in the sand, and there's other kind of, scratches on the landscape. And and I think there is a balance between a feeling for the mystery and the independence of the non-human animal, but also wanting to bring that animal into conversation with us. And so, I mean, the debate about, it's a simple word. I finished teaching this morning and all the words are gone out of my head. Anthropomorphizing. So the whole debate about anthropomorphizing, giving non-human things a voice or human qualities. One thing you can say about that is, well, who are we to say what are the human qualities? Like, why do we think, that we're anthropomorphizing a dog when we say a dog is smiling? That dog might be exactly doing the kind of thing we're doing when we're smiling. We just don't know. And is there anything wrong with making a bridge between each other, especially like in the case of an animal that's very, reflects our emotions so much as dogs have trained themselves to do. But so, I mean, it's a debate, Antonios, that is ongoing. I mean, it's not a question that can be settled. And I think having an awareness of it is what matters, kind of having a consciousness of the fact that, okay, I know I am making some assumptions and imposing certain things on a non-human entity that may not be appropriate or have anything to do with what the real experience of that being is. But at the same time, there's no way. We're not like these sealed off monads with no connection to these things. I think you genuinely, you think about a tree, trees communicate with insects, trees communicate with fungus, trees communicate with insects, and trees communicate with us if we let them. I mean, there is trans-species communication, and that doesn't have to do with kind of the linguistic in a human sense. So, but that's one of the exciting things about science is it's showing us so much about kind of the intelligence and the emotions and the sense of memory and the things that we used to think of as human that actually are active in the non-human world. So it's a rambling answer to your question, non-answer to your question, Antonio. But I think to keep that question alive and to always be asking it, I think is what has to happen.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, and before I give Kate the mic, I think what you talked about, I hope I pronounced it correctly, scratching and scraping, you know, I think is really helpful in tackling the question that Antonio said, and I think that all of us who deal with eco-critical questions have. I think it just requires a kind of rethinking of what communication actually is, and of what. I think it's even more difficult than rethinking communication, rethinking what language actually is. In the end, language is leaving traces, you know, in a way, particularly the way we modern humans use language. We leave written traces, but we also leave audio traces now. You know? And via the metaphor of trace, perhaps you know, we can see how the human animal and the non-human animal produce something that becomes readable if only you know the language. You know. So maybe that helps us to think that question a little further. But Kate.
Well, thanks so much for this talk. I really enjoyed it, and I'm kind of I don't know, I love all the questions that are happening, and I kind of have a question that I think maybe tries to kind of connect them, because I feel like I really liked what Ashley pointed out with the feminist reading of Moya Cannon, and just like Lena's question about sort of like larger global geopolitical systems of power intersecting. And I was just thinking about like the feminized landscape as being like, you know, very much about environment and power, and how resources are extracted, and that there seems to be kind of like a you know, kind of conversation about like I don't know, almost like we need a framework for building these ways of attending to like non-human agencies, particularly like what, you know, the idea of like apprehending these traces. And I don't know if you like have, I don't know how to like connect a lot of these different frameworks, because it feels like there's a lot going on there with, you know, even post-colonial theory and gender studies and queer studies and environmental theory, and just seeing how like, you know, even constructions of gender have like profound impact on the environment. And and like the kind of like local and global. I know this is a rambling question, I'm sorry. And it's but it feels like there's something there with like the way that even a local like finding of a bird is somehow not only like implicated in a larger structure of nature, but also of power and like colonialism and gender constructs, that just kind of I'm just curious if you have like read Moya Cannon in a way that like also thinks about how just even the construction of nature and the way that we sort of think about it, like Antonio was pointing out, writes kind of meanings onto the natural world. Does that make sense? I don't know. I'm kind of
there's a lot there, but I'm just trying to catch up with it all. So I mean, I think everything you're saying is connected, and it all kind of emerges right from kind of post-enlightenment binarized ways of organizing experience, and it's, you know, it's profoundly at the source of you know, colonialism and exploitation and enslavement, and you know, the as you say, the feminized landscape, the feminized body, feminized races, that is, you know, a science, you know, pseudoscientific rationale for all kinds of depredations and violence and exploitation over, you know, the last several centuries. And I suppose there's, you know, it's implicitly in the background of a lot of what Moya is doing. And even the kind of the occasional appearance of the Irish language is itself a gesture to the fact that, the language itself, speaking of human languages we've been doing, is colonized in Ireland by a foreign tongue. There's that is not our language. Portrait of the Artist, right? Stephen Deathless in Joyce's Portrait of the Artist talks about, speaking in a language that isn't his, even though it is the only language he knows. The character in the novel, and I don't know why I keep thinking about Mary O'Malley today, but she, she also talks about Irish as this kind of plant that has been cut down by the sharp blades of English language, but the roots are still there, and very much a kind of a masculine, violent, kind of hard English versus the soft, horticultural, natural thing that is the Irish language. So I think all of those layers of what you're saying are everywhere in the work. And I think I lost some. I started trying to write it down. I think I've lost some of the threads, but I think the point, and I think it's something that's coming across in all the questions, and both the written questions and the spoken questions, is that there's so many different discourses of domination that are being kind of engaged with through eco-criticism, ecofeminism, whatever you want to call it. Because it is about our being in the world and the ways in which those things are just embedded, not only spatially, but historically through time and space. There's, the temporal element of all this is important as well. I might have exceeded your question in ramblingness, but I don't know if it's helped at all, Kate, or not. But I made a stab at it anyway.
We are getting closer to the end of this session. Actually, we are already there, but I think we can allow one last contribution, because there's still one hand raised. And I would suggest that Marie-Claire doesn't get the last word, but the last question or comment.
Thank you. It's also a bit more, I have two things to say, and it's also a bit more rambling, but you mentioned Donna Haraway, and then we talked about this anthropomorphization, and it reminded me so much of her other work, like Companion Species, in which she talks about her dog, and it's not so much about saying like the dog is human, but to say like the dog is different from me, of course, but that doesn't mean that the dog does not have a language. And I think that's exactly the thing that we can see in this poetry here too. Like it's about criticizing this human uniqueness and saying we are exceptional because we have language. And the other thing I was interested in, or maybe you could, I think you mentioned it very briefly, like this Celtic tiger, but I'm really interested in how much the Celtic tiger and this economic boom that also went hand in hand with even more or an increase in environmental destruction in Ireland, how much that has influenced Moya Cannon's poetry.
I think absolutely. It's something that we see in some of the poems from around that time. She was both, she really did extend her kitchen at that time, and had this kind of self-ironic awareness of being caught up in all of this. And I do think that the fiction and poetry in the post-Tiger period is beginning to try and kind of grapple with that and understand, I think, especially the environmental implications of it, because it's like the thing I was saying early on about how eco-criticism in Ireland is like at full speed. It's gone from 0 to 60 very, very quickly. And I think that goes hand in hand. I think that's no accident that coincides with kind of the Celtic Tiger period. I think that it was like in your face in a way that had to be kind of processed culturally. And I do think that has been and continues to happen. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Marie-Claire.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, of course, to Maureen for giving us a lot of food for thought. A round of virtual applause, I think, is asked here. One last thing that I wanted to just tell you. You had said earlier in your talk whether you were wondering whether silent as a clam is also saying. In other words, in German we are silent as fish.
Oh, okay.
So which is still, you know, an oceanic creature, but I think it has.
There's even the expression to clam up when someone goes quiet. You clam up.
Yeah, but has, you know, totally completely different implications. You know,
Can I thank Lisa for all the great comments? I mean, it really has been very helpful, whoever that is. Thank you very much.
Okay. So thank you to you, but also to all of you who in one way or another asked questions, made comments. Maybe just one last word. There will be another not combined Irish Studies Environmental Humanities talk workshop, but an Environmental Humanities workshop next week, exactly a week from today. Yes, that's right. Lena, maybe you can just put in a link for more information for those of you who are interested to come. Thank you also to my colleagues Ina Bergmann and Maria Eisenmann for collaborating here and you know, for doing the bulk of the organizational work. Actually, it was a tremendous pleasure, you know, to hear these inspirational thoughts, and I hope you share this impression with me, and I hope I will see as many of you again at some place or another, digital, virtual, or real, at some point.
Yes, thank you all for the wonderful questions. Really, such good questions. Thank you.
So thank you, and I wish you a wonderful evening and an even nicer weekend. Goodbye.